Welcome to our holiday episode number 33 of the G2 on 5G. It's the latest inside scoop on everything 5G. We cover 6 topics in about 15 minutes, and it's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. I'm Will Townsend, and joining me again this week is my fellow analyst, Anshel Sag. So let's get started with my first topic. There's been, some discussion on social media and that sort of thing about Open RAN, and will it really have a demonstrable impact on 5G deployments? And actually, Light Reading, one of their contributors, spoke with one of the operators in the UK, and they basically stated that they don't see it dramatically impacting 5G. It's probably a 6G and beyond effect. We've talked about it on past podcasts, and I tend to agree with that. But there are going to be a few greenfield deployments, like Rakuten is one. Certainly Dish, as they ready their 5G deployment, and Reliance and India as well. So what are your thoughts?
I think we are still in the early days of Open RAN, and I think there is going to be a lot more pull towards Open RAN long term. But because of the way that operators have their infrastructure deployed today and the way that their networks work, there isn't that much incentive to rip and replace. Um, I think a lot of their equipment was already, a lot of the stuff that they have today for 5G was already installed with 4G and
Mm-hmm.
just software upgradable. So there's very little incentive for operators who already have existing infrastructure in place to go Open RAN. That said, I have a feeling that Open RAN will be more adopted in places like private networking, where
Mm-hmm.
it is a greenfield application
Yeah.
and it can be tailored to the customer's needs without having to, bend over backwards. So I think Open RAN is going to have a much bigger role in private networking than I think it will in commodity networks.
Yeah, I agree, with respect to 5G. I mean, almost every major operator around the world is at least, trialing and doing proof of concepts with it. The other point that I've made on prior podcasts is that Open RAN may be extremely CapEx disruptive, but not necessarily performance optimized. So I would agree with you. Certainly, greenfield public deployments that I mentioned, certainly private networking deployments, but some of those private networking deployments are going to require specific latency and for tactile operations like manufacturing automation and robotics and that sort of thing. But obviously time will tell. But I wasn't surprised to read that I believe it was 3 in the United Kingdom. I think they have a new CEO that's coming on board, and he mentioned that hey, I believe they're rolling with Ericsson and deploying the traditional infrastructure. But certainly, I think we'll begin to see it catch on in certain pockets, and we'll keep our eyes on that and report back as we see things develop. So let's move to your second, or actually your first topic, and you want to talk about China Mobile, and they've really ramped their 5G subscriptions.
Yeah, so what's interesting is we've been tracking these Chinese operators for quite some time, and we've all known that China is very likely going to be the country that scales 5G the fastest and to the highest number of users, which makes sense because they have the most mobile subscribers in the world. And the biggest operator, China Mobile, has been kind of giving like monthly and quarterly updates to how many users they've gained that are 5G users, specifically subscribers. And they recently reported for the month of November that they added 18 million new subscribers for 5G in November, which makes sense because there's so many 5G devices in market now
Mm-hmm.
that span the breadth of, $399 to $1,300, $1,400, depending on what your budget is. And they are now claiming, I want to say 147.38 million 5G subscribers, which is compared to 6.7 million back in January. So they've gained quite a few, even with COVID, and it's a pretty big achievement, I believe, and it's kind of the number that the rest of the world will piggyback on, in the sense that the total worldwide 5G subscriber numbers, which we'll probably find out in January, will most likely be, um, you know, around that 250 million subscriber total number that a lot of people were expecting. I think the number was 200 250, and I think that range, which I believe Qualcomm was the one who had kind of guesstimated out, which they're pretty good at doing. I think they were expecting that pre-COVID, and it's just an interesting thing because that's a lot of users for the first year of a G compared to 4G, which just did not have anywhere near that kind of uptake. So
Hmm.
operators are saying that they're deploying it 4 to 5 times faster and getting 4 to 5 times more users on 5G than it did with 4G. So
Yeah.
in spite of all the negativity that I think we've seen this year, I think 5G has actually been a relative success compared to 4G, and people just forgot how bad the 4G rollout was compared to 5G, simply because there's a you know it's been a decade, so people forget.
Yeah, yeah. It has been an extremely fast ramp relative to 4G. But from my perspective, China isn't really focused on driving discrete services tied to 5G, both on the consumer and commercial side. You may have a different opinion, but is a lot of this like China wanting to beat its chest to say that they're in the 5G pole position? What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. I
Yeah,
think this is definitely, that number is being used. I mean, it's the same thing with the base station number, right? It's
yeah.
a quantifiable way to claim leadership. That
Hmm.
said, they are also, I believe they've grown their network to standalone. So they are now a standalone network as well. So
Yeah.
I think that standalone is actually a more important achievement to me for most operators than
Hmm.
numbers, because you can't really scale 5G properly with what it's potentially capable of, which I'll be discussing in one of my other topics. And moving forward into the next releases, to have the SA.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, SA is the true measurement. So good stuff, man. Let's move to my second topic. And Ericsson announced this week that they're going to bring disruption to maritime communications with a 5G mesh network. And I find this, I think this is really going to highlight the capabilities of 5G given its low latency and its, ultra fast throughput and the ability to slice, for all sorts of things. But it seems to me, maritime, that's got to be old school, right? Sort of like, for years before FirstNet was rolled out by AT&T for first responders here in the US, it was a proprietary network that was developed by Motorola. And the challenge with that network for first responders in the United States was that it was great for communication, within the confines of a law enforcement cluster or a, fire department cluster. But then there was really no connectivity with that communication system with hospitals and and other important entities that first responders need to to communicate with. So I don't have a lot of depth in maritime. I do have a boat in Key West or in the Middle Keys, but I think this is it's a great move by Ericsson to bring 5G to an industry that is probably very rooted in the way that they've communicated for decades. What do you think?
I think it's interesting. Um, I don't know how much uptake it will have, or what the impact will be in the maritime industry, because I don't know, like you, I'm not as in depth um, on what necessarily are their pain points are. But
Yeah,
I think it's going to be interesting to see how it does accelerate the rate of just moving commerce, because I still believe that maritime is the number one method of shipping in the world.
sure.
So Having that data, there's probably tons of IoT data that needs to be transferred over those networks. So I think there's probably a net benefit there, and it'll be interesting to see how that develops over time.
Yeah, no, I can comment on ports. I've spent time in Riga at the 5G Detectory event, and I actually hosted some panels. And one of the panels we had, someone from the local port authority there, and how they're beginning to deploy 5G and IoT to manage. I mean, all of the operations of a port, which are incredible, right? You've got all of these large containers that are coming in. You have ships coming back and forth, and there's a lot of connectivity that needs to happen there. And certainly ports have been a shining example of private networking deployment within 5G. So I think that's going to be very translatable to just in general the maritime vertical. So, but we'll keep our eyes on that and report back as things develop. Let's move to your second topic this week, and you want to talk about 3GPP and when we should expect release 17.
Yeah, so as you know, 3GPP is the standards body that sets, it's not really a standards body, but it's a specification body, standards body that helps set the 3GPP spec, which is then adopted by different standards agencies like the ITU to build next generation networks. And 3GPP is basically what all the operators and device makers go by to interoperability and to build the networks that we've been using since 3G. And we are currently on release 15 and 16, and release 17 was supposed to be done next year, but due to COVID-19, they had to move back the timeline. And now the timeline is 2022, instead of 2021. And the reality is that this will be one of the bigger updates that will broaden the reach of what 5G can do. Because it hasn't been finalized, we don't really know what it will do, but a lot of the items that are work items right now are focused on basically industrial applications and making 5G better, because each of these releases kind of adds a new feature or
fine tunes
the standard to make it better. And the compliance with the standard is kind of what allows a device or a network to properly utilize its capability. So, something like a ability to do unlicensed is a big deal, because that's going to be probably utilized a lot in private networking.
Yeah.
And I think that it's fine that we're delayed a little bit, but it's still important because it's going to delay the rollout of 5G because there's a delay. And I think that it's okay because the operators are probably not really keeping up with that cadence. And for as long as it's not like a full year or a 2-year delay, I think we'll be fine. But it's something to pay attention to and make sure that COVID doesn't affect it too much, because most of these 3GPP meetings happen in person. And while they can happen, over Zoom and other applications, having them in person is still more valuable. And I think this is a good example of how the human element of standards creation affects how the technology moves forward.
Yeah, I mean, I was about to ask you that question because you're very technical, and it makes me wonder, like what can they not accomplish over video collaboration, that sort of thing. I mean, what from your perspective, what is really that critical element, and bringing actual people physically together to get this stuff done? I mean, is it that complicated from your perspective?
Well, it's very technical.
Yeah.
The thing is that there's a lot of like discussion and back and forth, because essentially these 3GPP meetings are a group of the people from the industry, and you have representatives from almost every company in the industry in the 3GPP meetings. And basically people are arguing with one another whether or not feature gets included. And part of that also has to incorporate the fact that there are people from different companies trying to get their technologies into the standard, either because they believe it's a superior standard or because they believe it's necessary for their company to be successful. So there's a lot of political, jockeying that happens as well. And
Sure.
release 17, one of the study items is called NR Extended Reality, which means that this might actually be the release that really incorporates some of the needs of XR to accelerate the growth of XR and 5G simultaneously. Because right now,
Hmm.
it's, in my opinion, a lot of people are just talking about 5G
Yeah.
and utilizing it, but there isn't really a complete understanding of how XR and 5G work together very well.
Yeah. And I think, that's an exciting combination. I mean, you and I have talked about the combination of AI and machine learning with 5G and what that can unlock. But, when you start thinking about mixed reality and think about, use cases where you could send a field service technician out with a lightweight, low power, foldable design as an example, and then use augmented reality, to diagnose, troubleshoot, and repair very quickly complicated machinery, like, in the oil and gas, industry is one example. So, I know you cover XR for the firm, but, from my perspective, that potentially the combination of mixed reality and 5G is going to really unlock a host of just really mind-blowing use cases that, people aren't even thinking about yet. And to your point, it's difficult, and it takes time to get there. And 3GPP can help support and accelerate that with Release 17. So hopefully it'll come sooner versus later, but we'll keep our eyes on that. Let's move to my third topic this week. And we've talked about 5G and military applications, but this week the US military announced that they want to make 5G the centerpiece of its future communications within military theaters with something called JADC2. So the military loves to use different acronyms and that sort of thing. So this is no surprise to me. Not a ton of detail there because it's probably classified, but what do you think?
Well, it's funny because JADC2 stands for Joint All Domain Command and Control.
Of course, you know
Thing
that.
is, it's a essentially what they're trying to do is unify the communication standards across all DoD departments.
Branches, yeah.
And my understanding is that they're going to be leveraging all types of communications, which
Hmm.
5G does incorporate, to basically create this network that allows for everybody to communicate with each other very easily and share amongst each other securely.
Okay.
My concern, especially when you look at like the most recent hack on the SolarWinds guys,
Right.
I'm concerned about what if you have this one network and somebody can traverse all departments
Hmm.
of the DoD because they're all in one network. And what if you can shut down that network? You've basically shut down the Defense Department. So I
Right.
find that, I really hope that they spend a lot of time on security and redundancy and preventing something like that from ever happening. But it worries me to a degree, especially considering how this recent hack penetrated multiple energy agencies.
Hmm.
I think it also penetrated the Department of Defense. So I'm just, I'm concerned. And I think it's a good thing for, mission readiness and military cohesiveness, but I also think it's a vulnerability. So I
Yeah.
think we really need to think about security and security first.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I mean, it's always going to be top of mind. And, maybe one solution is, you sort of break down these networks into discrete private networks, right? But certainly, yeah, that's going to be a challenge, and unification brings with it, simplicity and ease of management and that sort of thing. But to your point, it creates, vulnerabilities at the same time. So there weren't a ton of details there, but as things, develop and, whatever they're willing to share, but I'm sure a lot of this is going to be classified how they build it out. I would also assume that the military is partnering with, all of the usual suspects, from an infrastructure perspective. Cisco has great capabilities with respect to security, and they've really been pushing fast and furiously into a lot of these 5G deployments as well globally. So we'll keep our eyes on it and we'll report back. So let's move to your third and final topic this week. And you and I were on Twitter. We saw the news on the C-band auction, and it raised an incredible amount of money. But with that, I think it requires, some balance. But why don't you provide, kind of an overview on your take there?
Absolutely. So the C-band auction, which you and I both have been talking about quite a bit,
Yeah.
is a big auction that means a lot to Verizon and AT&T specifically, because it gives them access to mid-band spectrum, which they don't have, and they need to be able to build enough capacity in 5G to really deliver the speeds and coverage that are needed to deliver that 5G network experience. And right now, as of 12 hours ago, the auction has hit $50 billion,
Unbelievable.
which is the largest ever by any auction in American history, larger than the $45 billion that AWS3 raised
Mm-hmm.
about 8 years ago, 7 years ago. And as a result, Ajit Pai, the outgoing FCC chairman, tweeted out that, this is let's make the tweet. As of today, the FCC C-band auction is the highest grossing spectrum auction in American history at $50 billion, and it's not over yet. So this is a process that happens in rounds, and they're currently round 38. So it'll probably wrap up pretty soon, but they've crossed the $50 billion mark. So at this point, it's already a monster. He's bragging about how much money it's raised Americans, especially with one of his one of his one of the other commissioners,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just not something that I think is a good thing for the American public, um, because this spectrum, while we should be earning money from it as citizens, because it is technically a shared thing that we are licensing to the operators, ultimately these costs get passed on right to consumers. So by
Absolutely.
increasing the cost of um, the spectrum, all you're doing is increasing the cost of rolling out 5G to the operators, which means they have to find new ways to charge customers more instead of giving more customers access. So it's going to be much harder to give, rural operators or rural users any kind of access if it costs if the spectrum costs that much. And I, I'm not a fan of bragging about it. I do like when the government is able to make money on things that it does, like TARP actually ended up making us money. But I just think that making money for the government shouldn't really be a priority. It should be not losing money and incentivizing growth and allowing users and application developers and everybody that utilizes the spectrum that they're leasing out to maximize economic growth and prosperity. And bragging about $50 billion doesn't roll with me.
I absolutely agree. I mean, there's got to be a balance here, between filling the government coffers and providing, spectrum assets to deploy services. I mean, the FCC has done some great things with its fast 5G plan, but all of that gets negated, if they're raising $50+ billion on mid-band spectrum. To your point, that becomes part of the overhead that has to be covered and amortized, and that the way that it gets amortized is against subscriptions, right? And let's not forget that spectrum it is definitely a key part of how cellular, communications work. But you've also, as an operator, have to deploy extensive amounts of physical and virtual infrastructure to make this all work. And the price tag on that is in the billions of dollars. So when you add the two together, hey, someone's got to pay for that. Operators are in the business for profitability. They're not subsidized, although the federal government is providing some subsidies in areas like underserved rural America to get 5G out there. But I just think it sends a mixed message, and I agree with you. It's like, bragging about raising 50 billion with mid-band spectrum, I don't think is the right thing to do. But anyway, time will tell. But hey, Anshel, another great podcast. Why don't you take it home?
Absolutely. We hope our viewers and listeners found this week's topics interesting. If anyone out there would like to reach out to us on a specific 5G topic for a future podcast, please reach out to us on social media. Will is at Whaletown Tech, and I'm at Anshel Sog. We hope you have a great weekend, and please tune in again next week and have a great Christmas and happy holidays and even a great new year, hopefully.